I'll just start us off by saying that the idea behind this roundtable and the forum in the journal Environmental History that preceded it was as follows. It seemed to the editors, to Mark Hersey and to me, 24 months ago or so, when we first organized this forum, that authoritarianism was on the rise around the globe. That might seem a little less apparent in late November 2022, given the outcome of a few key elections around the world, as well as the war in Ukraine, which appears, at least at the moment, to have decreased Russia's global momentum. But these setbacks may or may not be temporary. And at any rate, when we first contacted historians to participate in the forum, it seemed reasonable to expect that authoritarianism would exert a greater influence on the world stage in years to come. And accordingly, as a service to the readers of the journal, we asked a number of prominent environmental historians, who I'm happy to say are all present here today as well, to put the environmental policies of right-wing authoritarian movements into their full historical context. And I should say that we intentionally excluded the United States from the discussion, reasoning that readers of a US-based journal were likely aware of domestic affairs sufficiently. And we left out countries that do not have working democratic elections. And that left a few countries with prominent political movements that could be placed under the broad umbrella of what might be called the new right. That said, identifying which countries belong in a discussion of this new right is a challenging enterprise, or was a challenging enterprise, because the supporters of what might be called a new right have not organized themselves around a label or an explicit ideology. There is, however, a loose set of priorities and values that we think sets the new right apart from traditional conservatism. And these would include, or could include, we can certainly discuss whether this typology is an effective one, but these include a distrust of elites, including financial elites, despite the fact that many leaders of new right movements are quite wealthy, a suspicion of large corporations, especially big tech and media firms, although new right leaders usually have no problem in using big tech or media firms for political advantage, an aversion to globalization and international alliances, a hostility to traditional loci of power, including government itself, despite an apparent attraction to strongmen with semi-dictatorial powers. Also part of the profile are traditionally popular conservative ideas such as ethno-nationalism and nativism. And religious identification is a prominent feature in some new right movements, but not all, so it's sort of a wild card. Based on these criteria, we chose to commission essays about the environmental policy of right-wing movements in Hungary, in India, in Brazil, in France, in Turkey, and in Germany. This list of 6 featured countries was not supposed to be exhaustive, but rather to provide geographical diversity and variety in terms of electoral success. And we were very glad that the first scholars that we contacted from each country were interested in participating. So we got our first choice in every instance. And even more happily, all of them have chosen to participate in the roundtable here today. They are, for Hungary, Viktor Paul; for India, Ron de Souza; for Brazil, Lise Sedrez; for France, Venus Bivar; for Turkey, Onur Inal; and for Germany, Julia Obertreis. I'm very thankful to all of them, not only for going through the difficult process of coordinating their essays in a forum which is appearing in the October issue of Environmental History, but also that they're willing to participate in the roundtable today. It's a wonderful public service they're providing, and I'm thankful for all of it, for all of their efforts. And then I have a few questions that I invite everyone participating to read the form in the journal, and I hope that we will at the same time touch on its notes and maybe go beyond the points that are made and have some interaction between the points that's possible today. But by way of spurring the conversation, I have a few questions that I hope that we could engage with. Number one, to what degree is it appropriate to use the term environmentalism outside its traditional post-war United States context? is it anachronistic or inappropriate to use the word environmentalism outside of the post-war 1950s US setting in which many historians have placed it? Second, is there such a thing as an identifiable authoritarian environmentalism? Does that even exist? Is that a contradiction in terms? And if it's not a contradiction in terms, what distinguishes authoritarian environmentalism? Does it have different priorities than customary environmentalism, the one that we're all, I dare say we're all familiar with? If it does have different priorities, what are those priorities? How do they differ? Third of all, how effective have critics of neoliberal environmentalism, the traditional environmentalism perhaps, been in characterizing environmental protection as state-based oppression? How successful has it been to use environmental legislation or environmental policy as a way to generate political support for groups that would undermine it, and perhaps replace it with something new, or perhaps not replace it with anything new? And lastly, has a lower electoral success or failure altered the environmental policy of right-wing populist movements? Has the effort to win popular support changed the way that right-wing populist movements and leaders have talked about the environment, the way that they have, has environmentalism or concern about the environment changed these movements, or on the contrary, have these movements changed environmentalism in the countries where it is a motive political force? So those are the questions that I hope would spur conversation. And with that, I will open the floor to responses.
Hey, Stephen, maybe we can move to Lise first, since the Environmental History Labs that she's part of down in Brazil is jointly hosting this.
That'd be fantastic. Absolutely.
In other words, I'm in the hot seat right now, right? Great. First of all, thank you so much for Viktor, Stephen, Mark, and all of you for putting this together. We have just finished our elections. Well, I'm not going to get into the Brazilian situation right now, but we are still in the hot seat right here as well. But those are very interesting questions. I'm not sure Brazil case is similar to so many of the others. In one case, there was never an attempt even to create an authoritarian environmentalism. I think since from even before his elections, Bolsonaro and his supporters were very much and unapologetically anti-environmentalists. They retrieved older versions. In fact, that some of in the left also shared a bit that about nativism and sovereignty, and an idea that Brazilians can do whatever they want with the Amazon, and whoever is saying otherwise is just imperialistic powers who are trying to challenge our sovereignty over Amazon. And that's it. That has been pretty much the basis for a lot of the legal undermining of protections. There is also something that Stephen didn't mention that I think has been part of these of this anti-environmentalist proposals, which is not only a distrust of elites, but just an anti-intellectual streak. There is at every single moment a challenge on science, a challenge on the nihilism is as much part of this as everything else. In the Brazilian case, religion has taken a part of it, in part also as a religious right has challenged the Catholic activism in the Amazon. Catholics have been very active in the protection of indigenous populations since the theology of liberation in the 1970s, and that has been documented. So there is a kind of dispute of territory here, and in this case, being anti-environmentalist and having more open access to missionary work, which means evangelization of indigenous populations, has put the religious right on the side of this anti-environmentalist agenda. I just would like to say, for the first question about the concept, I think that Ramachandra Guha and Juan Martínez Aliés, when they wrote The Environmentalist of the Poor, they kind of answered the question, and I think that's still a very good question. I mean, maybe environmentalism is not the same way it was in the post-war perspective, but has been incorporated and appropriated by so many grassroots and the global South organizations, that I think that we're fine with that. That's just okay.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for organizing all of this. It's great to be able to talk to everybody in person after working on this issue for so long. And also just to be exposed to all of these different variants. I know we all kind of end up working in our own little silos, and so I often don't get to sit down and think about environmental policy in Turkey, for instance. I mean, maybe just to pick out a couple of these questions, and maybe to build on what Lise was just talking about, I think one of the interesting things that the French far right have done is actually to embrace a version of intellectualism. So it's certainly a populist movement, but it's also at least posturing in the direction of having an intellectual foundation for the policies that they're proposing. And so the person who's at the forefront of a lot of the discussion of environmental policy is a man named Hervé Juvin, who is, you know, a member of the intellectual elite in France. He was trained at all the best schools. He publishes with the best intellectual presses. But he's absolutely a far right, you know, xenophobic nationalist. And so I just wanted to bring that up as an odd little quirk, in that we would often assume that this is going to be an anti-intellectual kind of movement. But I think in France, they're leaning into an intellectual foundation for the policies they want to propose, precisely in order to provide their constituents with the tools necessary to engage in a conversation with their political opponents. And so I think, you know, for the longest time, people who supported the far right in France, when issues surrounding the environment came up, they really didn't have anything to say. And now they've been given this vocabulary, they've been given talking points, so that when they are confronted by, you know, white collar bourgeois intellectuals who are advocating for various environmental policies, they have the language to fight back on those very same terms, which I think is a really powerful way of giving these constituents a way to fight back on a platform that had previously really excluded them. And maybe I'll stop there and give somebody else a chance to talk, since it's already 20 after 1.
Great. Well, alphabetically, the next country would be Germany, which would make a space for Julie Obertreis.
Yes, hello everybody. It's very nice to see you all, and my thanks go to Stephen and Mark for the forum they provided, and also to Viktor for organizing this. When I think about environmentalism as a term, in the first place, I feel grateful to use this term in the English language, because we don't have an equivalent in German. And I wrote about Germany here, this essay for this forum, but usually I work on the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And I use this term environmentalism to describe what happened in the Soviet Union, because it's a very broad term and an inclusive term as far as I can conceive of it. And it's also more action-centered than other terms. For example, environmental protection. Yeah, that would be a term very much used in former times in Germany, and now it's almost forgotten. Now everybody talks about climate protection and about energy production and so on. But so I use this term quite often when I relate it to the Soviet Union. But for Germany, for nowadays, I didn't use it in my text. I didn't write about right-wing environmentalism or authoritarian environmentalism. And that's probably connected to the fact that I wrote about Germany's AfD, the Alternative for Germany. It's a party that entered the parliament in 2017 and has been re-elected to federal parliament last year with a bit more than 10% of the votes. And this AfD, I don't see that they have a fixed set of political goals related to the environment. And I think also here's a difference to Hungary, because in other countries, because in Hungary you have the leading party, the party that is in power, and they have to deal with environmental issues. But the AfD in Germany, it's very much an opposition party. They oppose everything the others do, but they don't have a full catalogue of political goals or ideas, for example, connected to pensions or connected to other important political issues. And also, I would like to add to the list that Stephen has begun. We talked about suspicion of big companies, suspicion of the elites, I would add, ethno-nationalism, that's very much in place here. And also, of course, it's nation-centered, or everything related to energy or the environment is nation-centered. And in Germany, that's very much opposed to the European Union. So, for example, the AfD is calling for a renaturalization of agricultural policies, which is ridiculous when you think that very much of the money going into German agriculture is coming from the EU. And without the European Union, German agriculture would simply crack down. But this is one of their demands. And also another thing, and that's the last thing, I will stop there, is that they love to talk about the homeland. And probably that is a parallel to other countries. This nice, beautiful homeland, the German homeland, the Heimat, that they strive to protect, and which shouldn't be disfigured, for example, by these awful windmills. Wind power is a very strong energy power in Germany. It's about almost a quarter of the energy mix. So this is a big discussion about windmills, and the AfD and other right-wing forces, they say that it's disfiguring the landscape, and also it's allegedly reducing biodiversity by killing birds and so on. So this nation-centered approach and the homeland issue could maybe be added to the list. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Julia. The next country alphabetically, at least in English, would be Hungary. So, Viktor.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, this is not in my contribution, but I think one of the reasons why there is not many new ideas in contemporary Hungary's the way the political elite is framing environmentalism or the environment in general is because they do not. What they are doing also in other realms is to build on past achievements or past discourses, and this is what is happening in terms of environmentalism or environmental protection or nature conservation or other aspects. And they do not select whether it's a communist influence or an influence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire or from the interwar era. They're using the scientific discourses that unfolded in the past 200 years and recycling, not directly, but indirectly, those ideas and those notions and those discourses, and even then selecting some of them, which seem to be, for some reason, positively considered by the elite and some negatively considered by the elite. So I focus on two particular ways in my contribution that is considered to be a positive notion of conservation or environmentalism. or nature protection for the ruling elite. One of them is hunting, as you might guess. And the other one, interestingly, is nature walking. And I start my discussion from there, right there from the nature walking renaissance in Hungary. And I'm connecting it with current discourses on other topics as well in Hungary. And I wonder in my contribution why nature walking and walking trails and selected walking trails, not just any walking trail, but a certain walking trail, the Blue Trail in Hungary, got handpicked by the elite and had been very heavily funded and with various infrastructure investments to entice more and more nature lovers. And there could have been other issues that I could have picked up, pedaling or bicycle tourism, or there's a handful of bird watching, a handful of other ways. But I just thought that the limitations we had, they would suit perhaps the two most striking ones, and most like one of them is the most debated one, hunting, obviously, but the other one I think is the most controversial in terms of positioning it, because who would think that nature walking is bad, right? And then Orban and his regime is heavily promoting nature walking. So how does it fit in the overall frame of, as he likes to call it, illiberalism? But yeah, but I think that's just it's just branding it, basically.
Okay, very well. Thank you, Victor. Next country alphabetically would be India. So Rohan, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Stephen and Mark and all the others, I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I'm so glad that this panel idea has also come through. Very quickly, I would like to actually answer one of the questions that Stephen was kind enough to put for the panel to consider. And that question is there such a thing as an identifiable authoritarian environmentalism? If so, does it have different priorities than customary environmentalism, and what are they? Yeah. To that question, I would like to answer yes. There are features, at least in India, and this recent dispensation of the Modi government, which clearly shows that they are striking a very, very new framework and paradigm, as it were, on the environmental question. And bear with me, I just take a quick few minutes to run this through the audience here. Environmental historians have really had three distinctive frameworks in the Indian context. From the early 1980s onwards, the idea was you have the local community versus the developmental state. So the heart of environmentalism was actually politics, interestingly enough, but the politics of people-centered imaginations and local communities. By the late 1990s and early 2000, you have this moving increasingly towards policy. That is institutions, informed processes. You have even some ways of trying to institute certain legal regimes. And really what we get is a kind of environmentalism as this huge arena of negotiation between experts, affected communities, the legal process, and institution building. From 2014 onwards, with the emergence of the Modi government and populist politics, you can see a very, very new kind of attitude towards environmentalism. And it is, let me explain in this way. First of all, what you get is the gutting of institutions. And now you get the legal processes actually being commanded by the state in a way that you have the emergence of, say, strongman politics. And so it's the will of the leader that actually decides on environmental matters. that's one very important aspect, the will of the leader. Secondly is the emergence of state environmentalism, and that is really climate change politics. So you get the Modi government taking incredibly, rhetorically, I should say, huge decisions about renewable energy, COP rounds. So environmentalism is now very much part of geopolitics, much more than it is about popular movements. And the third aspect is that instead of a negotiation between institutions, affected communities, and a kind of legal process, now it's essentially gutted. In my essay, I point out how they've emptied expertise from all kinds of bodies and institutions. And really, right now, what it becomes is just the will of the leader. Yeah. So if you were to ask me, is there a specific authoritarian environmentalism? Yes, two aspects. The emergence of the will of the leader as a decider in environmental matters, and a notion of state environmentalism, where environmentalism now is part of geopolitics. Yeah. But if there is a glimmer of hope in this, is that, and this I draw from Cas Mudé's writings on populism, that in a very bizarre, ironic, and strange way, populism also, in some way, makes an opening for politics. Politics that was abandoned in consumer society is now coming back as an arena. And so what one gets actually is a more intense approach towards environmentalism from the angle of politics. Many of us think that the 90s and 2000s was too caught up in questions of the courts and committees. It was too loaded in favor of expert decision-making and expert discussions, even though I think some of the institutions were really pro-people, pro-environment, and so on. So one could really get into the gritty of that much later. But essentially what we are now getting in India is that environment questions are going to be political questions. And it's not about the political questions of the small community versus the big state, but it's really going to be about questions of justice, human rights, equity, and also what the environment really means to both in a philosophical sense and the sense of, how it meets those ideas about what makes life sustainable and flourishing. Yeah, I hope I kind of put forward those ideas. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ron. And the final country is Turkey. So, Onur, Inal.
Thank you, Stephen. So I am the last one in this round. In the second round, I will talk more about Erdogan and his authoritarian environmentalism. I think in general, we will talk more about the definition of authoritarian environmentalism. So to respond to Julia, so we have in Turkish the word environmentalism, but environmentalism itself did not exist until the 1990s. So in a modern European Western sense. So I want to talk a bit about the background, to respond to the first question. So when we look at Turkey, post-war years were a period of economic development and growth in Turkey. There was a lot of infrastructure projects, so state-initiated projects in the 1950s and 1960s. So at the same time, Turkey became a part of international conventions and major treaties, environmental organizations, and protection and improvement policies. So there was a kind of intertwined environmental policy making, environmentalism, and economic growth. So it was they were all intertwined. And policymakers, they propagated the idea that the environmental protection and economic growth could go hand in hand, and with rational planning, organization, international cooperation, and so on. So basically, for Turkey, we can talk about state-initiated, state-led, top-down environmentalism in post-war years. And non-state actors, NGOs, they did not exist in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So remember that the first environment-related protest movement occurred in 1975 in Samsun on the Black Sea coast. So villagers affected by poisonous gas, so they demonstrated for the first time, and they filed for damages. And so this is a kind of an embryonic stage of environmentalism in Turkey, 1970s, beginning of 1980s. But then we have a military coup in 1980, which set back environmental struggles and movements for a decade or for several years until 1990s. And then from 2000 on, so we have the Erdogan period, and it's a different story. And I think we will talk more about it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, everyone's been very efficient with their time, which is always appreciated. But we still have a bit of time left, quite a bit of time left. So I want to know if there are important issues for understanding the topic that you didn't get a chance to express in your initial statements. I guess we could go around in alphabetical order again if you like, unless there's somebody who has a pressing something pressing they want to say. No? Okay, well then let's go around a second time then, since it's a round table, it's only appropriate. Then alphabetical seems to be as good as any. So Lise, your second statement, if you like.
I think that I would like to go for, since we have just gone through elections, I would like to go for the fourth questions. If this kind of anti-environmentalism proposal by Bolsonaro did have an effect on our elections. It's too soon to say, but we can see in terms of the reactions to the results of the elections, he was defeated, but he was defeated by a thin razor margin in Brazil. And the areas in which he had very good support, very good numbers, are exactly the ones where the agribusiness and the more traditional agribusiness and where the gold diggers are there. So yes, his proposals of eroding environmental protections harnessed him a lot of support, lots of support. It's not a small one. In fact, a good part of those who are protesting against Lula's election come exactly from this anti-environmentalist background in the northeast, in the north of Brazil. It was also very interesting to contrast the reception that Lula received in the COP27 in Egypt, which was, he was a president-elect, he was received as if he was the actual president. The Minister of the Environment was pretty much ignored, and that gave some fuel for protests in Brazil when the local Bolsonaro supporters were saying, see, that's the globalists want to welcome Lula and not us. So the thing has been very divided. It was very interesting to see, for instance, in the places where most indigenous populations were voting, it was almost total votes for Lula. In the places where we have seen more agribusiness expanding, devastation of the forest, it was 80% for Bolsonaro. So I would say that that it did have a success that for those bases that felt emboldened in a way they hadn't been before Bolsonaro took election. So my point is, it's efficient. Okay, it's quite efficient, this kind of discourse.
Okay, great. Venus?
Yeah, I was thinking about question number 4. And I guess like Julia, I'm the only one also writing about a party that has never actually been in power, unlike the other contributors. And until about a decade ago, the French far right was not talking about the environment at all. And the adoption of an environmental policy was really tied to the desire on the part of the party to go more mainstream and to develop a more fully realized political platform. Since when the party was first established in the 1970s, for the longest time, it was really just a one-party platform, and that was anti-immigration. And one of the things that I think has been most interesting about the way that the far right in France has adopted an environmental position is that it is so ideologically coherent in that their environmentalism is also really rooted in xenophobia and anti-immigration, so that one of their main talking points is that if we allow for open borders and more migration, that will experience massive biodiversity loss at the level of the human race. And so they argue that miscegenation is going to destroy the cultural specificity that makes humanity so amazing, right? And so there'll be these really tortured kind of backhanded comments about, how Indians should stay in India, or Syrians should stay in Syria because that will protect the biodiversity of the human race. And that has been that has really resonated for supporters of the party because it allows them to maintain this really retrograde, xenophobic, racist position, but to couch it in a liberal, ecological vocabulary, right? And so what Julia said kind of reminded me of that, given that in Germany, there's also this strong emphasis on the Heimat and the homeland. And maybe the last thing I'll say is that this isn't necessarily a new development in French right-wing thinking. There's a long tradition that goes back at least 100, 150 years of thinking in terms of xenophobia and the environment. Maybe one example I'll throw out, just because I only discovered it in my research a week ago. There was a conflict between fishermen and the petrochemical industry in the south of France in the 1960s. And the fishing industry was collapsing because the water was so intensely polluted. And one of the people who came to the defense of the fishermen was actually this notorious founder of French right-wing thinking in the early 20th century named Charles Maurras. And he published in the French media, defending the rights of the fishermen on the ground that this was the sort of traditional backbone of the French economy, and you can't lose the fishermen because they are the soul of France. But anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there as another example of this very nativist, localist thinking that is really at the core of what the French far right is putting forward as an ecological platform.
Great, thanks. Yeah, maybe a theme that might be emerging is getting comparisons between countries that the speakers are aware of after hearing the talk. So if that's a point that occurs with the speakers for the second round, maybe that's something they could draw attention to. The next country alphabetically would be Germany. So it's Julia's turn again.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to pick up on what Rohan said about the connection between environmentalism and geopolitics. And it has become very, very obvious this year in consequence of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, starting from February 24. And as you all know, there are sanctions, economic sanctions, political sanctions against Russia. And Russia doesn't supply any more gas to Germany from September this year. So this is really a deep cut in energy politics and energy supplies. And our green minister of the economics, he has now a very difficult position because he has to supply gas for the winter and has to abandon the path of extending renewable energies only. So of course the Green want to expand renewable energies, and they don't want to buy more gas, but now it's very much needed because everybody's afraid of a cold winter. So this is the discussion that was very much up to date in the last weeks. And then you can ask yourself, okay, which stance does the Alternative for Germany take in this situation? I think that they haven't really changed anything in their views and politics. They had very strong connections to Russia from the very beginning. For example, the now chairman of the Alternative for Germany has met with a Russian foreign minister Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, in Moscow in 2020. And there are numerous other examples. So they have regular journeys to Moscow. It's quite clear that they get money from Moscow too. And so, of course, they were against sanctions. They have not outspokenly criticized Russian aggression in Ukraine, the war. And they are against deliveries of weapons to Ukraine. That's a topic that is very much discussed in Germany all the time. So yeah, so here you see, of course, that they are not very flexible in their political views, and I think that they might lose electorate because this won't be very much in line with most of the population. You say usually that it's about 10% hardcore electorate of this far right. And yeah, and they have gotten 10% in the last federal elections, but they tend to get much more in the state elections in different parts of Germany. In some parts in the east, they get up to 23, 25%.
Okay, very well, thank you, Julia. Viktor, you're up.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I would like to continue along with the lines of the other contributors and press on why certain pieces of agenda are selected by the ruling elites in certain countries. And crucify me, but I think environmentalism is very often not about the environment itself, but it's about the people and their real agendas. And whenever I'm looking at a discourse or a debate in the 19th century or in the interwar era or in current day debates, the environment often is a stage for economic and social discourses. And I think this is also happening in Hungary at the moment. And so the government is framing certain issues as environmental or conservationist or whatever, but the bottom line is often not about conservation, it's not about the environment. I mean, this environment is seen as a resource for economic development. And this is also connecting to the 200-year-old debate, how to make Hungary fully industrialized country in a way that it's keeping its special character. That is leading us to other discourses, because the nativist discourse wouldn't work out because it's a country of immigrants. The gene pool is like absolutely mixed. So that who is a real Hungarian, that discourse just wouldn't really work out very well. There are no left, basically. And on the other side, certain individuals or lobby groups, and we can go back to socialism or end of socialism, or even to the 19th century or late 18th century, they're instrumentalizing the environment or certain areas or certain species to achieve certain cultural, social, or economic goals. And what I see is that they often clash, but for me, it's very difficult in most cases. For me, it's very difficult to see what's right and wrong. Because I detach myself and my work from the political connotation of left and right, and who I vote for, and what's my preference, and how I envision Hungary should progress in the future, or what's my, how I would like to see Hungary. And I try to see things and the discussions naked as they are, in a way. And I think that's my role as a historian, even when it's a contemporary discourse. So yeah, just to be very clear, I'm sick of the people who are running the show, but they can say things which might actually make sense, not only as economic and social arguments, but also arguments for non-human species. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Next up, Rohan.
Fine, that's me. Yeah. Let me get back to Stephen's first question. To what degree is it appropriate to use the term environmentalism, quote unquote, outside its traditional post-war United States kind of framing? Yeah. For that, and this is something I didn't quite get a chance to discuss in the short piece that I wrote for environment history. The notion of environmentalism has been kind of twisted and changed in India in 2014, from 2014 onwards, in my own assessment. So if you looked at the wave of protests in the 70s, 80s, and 90s against large dams, against nuclear power stations, against GMOs, the great anxieties about that as well. Today, under climate change, hydroelectricity is a renewable energy and something that is pursued as an environmental project. So is it with nuclear energy, and so is it with GMOs. So there's a whole raft of protests that challenge certain ideas of the environment and nature that are kind of inverted post, well, not exactly 2014 only, but even slightly earlier than that. There were a lot of demands that, hydroelectricity is the way forward and we need more dams and so on and so forth. Interestingly, renewable energy, if you looked at the history of that term and that word in India at least, it was supposed to be a technology that was meant to address questions of local empowerment and very much linked to decentralized governance and management. But renewable energy today is all about market and pricing and centralized grids. And it's also about, these huge firms now getting into the question of solar energy and wind and so on and so forth. So the whole question of renewable energy as being part of a democratic technology, that has been completely sidestepped. And what you're getting now is really talk about markets and about renewable energy as addressing questions of prices and profits and so on and so forth. So to the question, the notion of environmentalism itself seems to have undergone some changes. The language, what it meant to address in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I would say, has been kind of inverted increasingly as climate change, which is now a very state-run discourse and managed discourse, things that were challenged by popular environmental movements now have been kind of radically transformed in such a way that those that we challenged and protested against now are coming back to us as basically environmental logics. So dam construction, nuclear, GMOs, markets, profits, large companies, this has become environmentalism, yeah? So to that first question, I think that's an important way for us to also think how not just the mainstreaming of environmentalism, not just the fact that it's something that now addresses neoliberal market logics, but that in some ways it's also something that can feed into a very authoritarian sensibility. And I think that is deeply worrying. In a way, what I'm trying to say is that you can't take the usual familiar understanding of environmentalism for granted. It's somehow not necessarily automatically a democratic question anymore. At least I would say that would be a fair assessment about what's happened in the last 8 years in India. That environmentalism increasingly is becoming something that works to disempower a kind of a localized knowledge, rights, and even questions of justice. Yeah. So in that sense, I see it having been transformed very fundamentally from the original premises on which it was started. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we're right on time for our last roundtable participant. Thank you, Rohan. So Onur, you have the last statement.
Yeah, I agree with what Viktor said. So environmental is not about environment itself. And I will also make an addition and also respond to the second and third questions. So environment is, I'm talking for authoritarian regimes, is also at the same time a part of the political agenda. So in the 21st century, authoritarian regimes, they are mostly neoliberal regimes, extractivist regimes. So Brazil and Turkey are at least good examples. So they rely on extractivist practices, and these practices are combined with populist rhetoric. And for authoritarian regimes, the environment is a major area to kind of showcase their developmentalist vision and populist rhetoric. And this kind of sparks grassroots environmental movements in these countries, in Brazil, in Turkey, in India, and all other countries. And the regime, the authoritarian regimes, so they use environmentalism to suppress all these critical voices, kind of as a response to suppress them, to discredit all these grassroots movements and oppositional voices, kind of they use as a political instrument to delegitimize and criminalize the critical voices. So one of my colleagues, Ekin Kurtić, she uses the term greening for authoritarian regimes. So she says in Turkey, for Turkey, environmentalism does not exist, but there is greening. So it's a kind of a part component of authoritarian environmentalism. And what is greening? For example, President Erdogan once he proclaimed himself as the best environmentalist, the real environmentalist, and he cited the number of trees planted during his term. So he declared that his government planted 3.5 billion trees some 10 years ago. And I found on internet that Donald Trump, he used a similar rhetoric. So he said, okay, you know, we are planting a billion tree project. He's talking about the United Nations project, so not the United States, and it was a trillion trees initiative, not a billion. Anyway, so all these populists, authoritarian regimes, they kind of they instrumentalize all these how to say symbols and metaphoric definitions. So I would say, and Venus, she mentioned that in Germany, also in France. So the far right, they also divide the society between us and them. That's also typical in Turkey. So there's a kind of a demonization of enemies, internal and external. Whoever is against the government or against all this greening project is kind of an enemy of the regime. So anyway, the response to suppress the oppositional voices. So it's a large spectrum from persuasion till intimidation and violence, and it depends on where you are and which regime you have. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So there we are at our hour, and we understand that people may have to go, and so that's fine too. But perhaps the panelists might have a few minutes to field questions. I saw one hand raised in the chat line, and if so, that would be fantastic if there were a bit of time for Q&A, and if there are questions that the audience would like to pose to the panelists.
Thank you, Stephen. I just would like to discuss a bit with Rohan. His first question, I found it very interesting with this overlapping of agendas and how environmental issues are also very political issues. And like questions of social justice. In Brazil, however, is quite different in the sense that there is the same rejection of an environmental agenda is also a rejection of human rights agenda. And in this sense, it's not a rupture or a twist, as you said, for the sense of environmentalism in India, but it's a continuation. It's common, you should have read in the newspapers that Brazil is one of the countries where more environmental activists have been killed in the last decade, in the last year. And it sounds like a novelty, but in some ways it is not. It's the continuation of a trend, because the countryside in Brazil has always been violent. The right has always killed people who then were not 30 years ago, 50 years ago, were not called environmentalists, but they are fighting for access to land. So, and you can say that for the Latin Americans for the last 200 years, every time we have small producers against plantation growers or small indigenous communities, they're going to be killed. Defenders are going to be killed. What we have seen in the last 50 years is an overlapping of this agenda of access to land, to access to clean land, to clean water, and that just makes the violence not only against people and communities. It's not only social justice that you're talking about, but also environmental justice. So in some ways, as Rohan was talking about ruptures and twists, I'd like to talk about continuities and how this authoritarianism gets new areas in which it asserts itself.
Okay, that's very interesting. Are there any questions for the panelists? If so, it's great, and if not, that's fine too. Okay, well, I want to give people a chance to, sometimes it takes a moment to work up the courage to ask a question in the panel setting. But it seems like there's no one who wants to, which is fine. So with that, I'll thank all the panelists sincerely for their participation, both in today's roundtable and in the forum that precedes it. I invite any interested people to consult the—
Stephen, it seems that Yulia and Viktor want to say something.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Please feel free.
Okay,
Yulia was first.
I just thought that maybe questions would in fact come up from the audience when we bridge a little bit of time.
Right.
And also I want to remind us all that the recording is still going. Maybe not everybody wants to be recorded. I don't know, we could stop this here. But what I wanted to say is that there is another thing I think we haven't addressed it yet when we talk about this authoritarian right-wing environmentalism, and that's the anti-scientific stance. And that was very much in place when the right wing talks about climate change. To this day, they just deny it. They say there is no human-made climate change. And it was also very obvious during the pandemic, because they didn't listen to what experts said and spread all kind of false information and conspiracy theories and so on. So this is something that should be, I think, mentioned in the list of the characteristics of illiberal or authoritarian environmentalism.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and anti-elitism of all kinds, I think, is a really important feature. Yeah. Okay, there were other hand. Victor, did I hear that
Yeah.
you were interested? Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to just tell a funny bit, a funny story that I think it's a symbolic one, and I like it very much. So when the Hungarian communists heard first about Rachel Carson, they didn't like Rachel's work at all, and I don't know, it was centrally orchestrated, or it was just, you know, a bunch of dudes writing stuff about a woman, like misogynist, sort of scientific, you know, claims, but it was just misogyny in a way that Rachel Carson's arguments were hysteric and emotional and non-scientific, and it was laughing matter. But this was the mid 1960s, and the discussion changed in about 5 years so much, and it was also connected to the instrumentalization of environmentalism, like quite hardcore version of environmentalism in a way in communism. And I think the political elite and the scientists connected that those claims, those environmentalist claims, could be very well instrumentalized in the socialist regime in a Cold War setting. And part of that puzzle was Rachel Carson as a piece that her work just fitted the piece very well to target shortcomings of the capitalist system, and the science that was also partly feeding Hungarian science, Western science, obviously via licenses and joint ventures and so forth, but it was also an instrument to credibly criticize Western science. And so Rachel Carson's reading changed just in 5 years from a laughingstock, from a hysteric woman, as they wrote, to someone who was a very serious critic, cornerstone of scientific thinking, criticizing Western modes and capitalist modes of production. And I think that is, to me, that's a very symbolic one, because the Silent Spring stayed the same, and Rachel Carson's arguments stay the same, and the anthropogenic environmental impacts stayed similar when it comes to DDT and herbicides and pesticides. But the reading of it just changed because of scientific, social, political, you name what aspects.